Well, good morning.
Good morning.
All right. This is a fun subject to talk about. I mean, this is one that keeps me up at night and largely why we got into the calibration business. Um, there was a study done by Essential Technologies and Brunno that had some pretty profound results, around four different conditions of calibration. The factory settings, a poor calibration, no calibration, and then one vehicle that was actually recalibrated with high-tech equipment in the right conditions, and pretty different results. And so it's interesting that we even have a debate around are they necessary or not. But what's your thoughts on calibrations in general, and then some of the results of the study?
Well, I have to agree to a great extent. It's hard to believe that we're not debating, but talking about calibrations and the necessity and how important it is to do it the right way. I think most of that lends itself to ignorance and/or lack of training, knowledge, and that's why we're up here, and that's why the white paper was done, and everything else. It's like ignorance isn't a defense when it comes to repairing a vehicle. We have to do it right, not knowing that removing a part can lead to a necessary calibration. Educating yourself and having the resources and knowing where those resources are to locate and find that is very, very important in the process. So the study, profound in what its findings were, for sure.
Bud?
So it's interesting to me, right? The study to me didn't reveal anything that we didn't already know. It is the same thing that we've been talking about with ADAS calibrations for as long as we've been talking about ADAS calibrations. And it's the entire reason that, ICAR and why we created an ADAS technician role, why we created all the online curriculum, why we have hands-on training. Everybody understands that the ADAS systems, they're highly sophisticated systems, they're intelligent systems, but they also have to understand that they're very trusting systems. They assume that you've done all of the things that you need to do to set that vehicle up for a calibration properly for that calibration to be right? So if you look at the results of the study and the fact that, well, if you don't do a calibration, okay, you got a problem, right? If you do the calibration wrong, you potentially have an even bigger problem. So it just makes sense. If you look at some of the things, I think one of the things in the study was a sensor being off as much as 0.4 of a degree results in, several feet of the angle of where a forward-facing camera or some of those systems are going to be seeing. We've got some things that we do where we can take a laser and set it on a table, and depending on which way we flip the device, it'll move that laser 2 degrees. And when you move it you think about 2 degrees is not very far. But when you put it in a room and shoot it across the wall with a laser onto a wall about 60 feet away, it's about 8 feet over to the side. So if you think about that, if that happens, now you're looking in the other lane and not seeing what you're supposed to be seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, this keeps me up at night, and some people still think no dash lights on, no warning lights on. Systems are indicating that they're working all good, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. Like I said, we got into the business because even with our dealer affiliation, we realized that the calibrations weren't happening correctly. And when you're committed to putting a safe and proper repair back on the road, you have to have validation that it was actually calibrated correctly.
Yeah, and so it all goes back to what Andy was just talking about. It starts with training, understanding what you need to do, understanding that for many of the static calibrations, you can't have more than 1 degree of slope in the floor that you're calibrating on using the OEM equipment. I understand there are aftermarkets out there that say that they compensate for the slope of the floor and all those things, but at the end of the day, for us, as ICAR, the OEM's the Bible. We do what the OE says. And if they say you need to use this plumb bob and this string and you need to do it this way, that's what you do. And if they say you can't have more than 1 degree of slope in the floor, How many shops have you been in that don't have more than 1 degree slope in the floor? Right? So they need to be thinking about these things. They need to understand what is required in order to do it correctly.
Yeah, I'll certainly piggyback on that a little bit, simply for the fact with our stores and learning about calibrations and the necessity of the environment, including the floor, the lighting, the total conditions that exist there. We had to go from having a mobile service that may have been doing things appropriately per the book, but our conditions, our environment was not appropriate for the calibration to be precise. We have slope in the floor that would not be conducive to what is required. We have lighting, both ambient and outside lighting, that are potential problems. Metal poles, color differentiations, reflectors all over the place with taillights, headlights, you name it. So learning that and knowing that we're, number one is the customer safety and doing the repair right. It's not dollars and cents, it's doing the right thing. And we, for that reason, had to find a third party that could control all of those environmental factors to do calibrations right, and we feel very confident and better about that decision.
You know, it's interesting also with the mandates that are out there. I think it's 2030 looking for that emergency braking system to be on every vehicle, and they are certainly avoiding crashes. But I wonder, you know, what happens, or how do we as an industry actually validate that, right? The calibration is done, and what type of documentation is going to be required so that you know that you put a safe vehicle back on the road, or a vehicle that's going to maybe change hands, and how, you know, what type of documentation will be required? Because if you think about it, 10 years from now, when probably the baseline of technology is the leading technology of today, it's going to be crazy if we don't really get our arms around not only the understanding of what a proper calibration is, when it needs to be done, but then also that verification that it was in fact done correctly. In that study, they showed more variation on a vehicle with just 12,000 miles from factory settings. So do calibrations or recalibrations become part of maintenance? You know, as you go in like your oil change and they're going to recalibrate all of your systems. The technology is driving a different way to look at this stuff, and obviously pretty critical, and something that our industry really has to get our arms around in a hurry.
So I'll give you just an example of some of that, right? So you're talking about the maintenance and the potential maintenance on this stuff. We were out at a shop watching somebody do a repair. It was a hail repair. They pulled the front bumper cover off the vehicle, put the front bumper cover back on just for refinish process. When we went out to test drive the vehicle, the forward, adaptive cruise didn't work. Now, what did they do that could have possibly affected any of that? When they were putting the bumper cover back on, the cover just barely hit the sensor that was on the mounted to the front reinforcement, and now what the angle was off. So you think about, you hit a big pothole, you hit something hard, what is it doing to these sensors, right? Think back to, you remember back in the days when we first got the sensors that were monitoring whether or not you had somebody in the seat, and they had demos at one of these shows where somebody was like hitting the side of the car with a shopping cart and it was throwing that off. So think about that. So what is it doing with these things? And it's a valid point. And when you think about the fact that they're projecting, what is it, $50 billion industry for ADAS by 2030, there's going to be a lot out there.
Yeah, I think when you think about just driving conditions, right? Potholes, I've seen people go over speed bumps that would rival many impacts that we repair on a regular day-to-day basis. You've got the owner's manuals that we've seen. We know when to change the oil. We know when certain service integrals are going to happen. And I don't think that we've got that understanding yet for the ADAS systems, and I think that's something that really needs to be explored as well. So there's some sort of ongoing maintenance of when you should expect to be able to have a sensor calibrated, just to know that you're right.
You know, you realize that you know, as we move forward and this technology continues to advance, we've got to advance with it, with our equipment, with our understanding, our diagnostics moving forward. We have to maintain customer confidence. You know, if the customers are having issues, which I think in the study it said something like 50% of the customers were having issues with their advanced driving assist systems after the car was repaired, that's just destroying customer confidence, along with obviously putting potentially unsafe vehicles on the road. In a couple of the cases where there was no calibrations and the sensors were damaged, the vehicle made no attempt to stop. So it hit you know, the source really without any braking whatsoever. So you can just imagine passengers are in there, that's pretty catastrophic results.
Yeah. So that kind of takes me back to another quick story that I've got. When we were first going down our ADAS journey, we went out and went to a facility where we did a calibration using a brand new vehicle and all the OEM targets and equipment. Calibrated the vehicle. We marked on the floor where it was so the vehicle could be brought back to the exact position. Then went out and had a target, put a cameraman who was sitting out here in the audience in the back seat with that camera and drive at the target, and the vehicle stops, no driver intervention, no problem, does exactly what it's supposed to do. Take that same vehicle back inside the facility, calibrate it using an aftermarket tool and equipment, go back out to the same target. It didn't even slow down. It punted the target 300 yards across the parking lot. All we changed was the tool that we used to calibrate it. So again, I'm not suggesting that there's not aftermarket things out there that might work. Just make sure you're doing your research and you're doing the right things, because things like size of the target, you know, the coloring and pixels on the target, it makes a difference in the way that these systems calibrate.
Yeah, that's a great point, but because with the aftermarket equipment, you're right, maybe in certain situations it's okay, but do you really want to find out? And it's also, they're going to be behind in their updates with the changing technologies of that manufactured vehicle, where the OE equipment is going to be up to date. You know, it's some pretty scary stuff that we've got to deal with, and you know, it's just a responsibility that we have as an industry to make sure. I had the misfortune last winter on my 24 Tundra of spinning it out on the highway and putting it into a snowbank in some pretty ugly winter conditions. And like any other customer, I'm out there right in the middle of the blizzard looking at it, trying to convince myself there's not a lot of damage, right? Well, getting it back and disassembling the vehicle $10,000 later, we've got a new front end on this Tundra. About 4 months later, I'm going to one of our stores, and it's in the afternoon, and you have to make a left turn getting onto the main road, and the sun just is beaming right into your eyes. There's a Subaru in front of me who started out onto the road. No traffic was coming, so we thought, and I started out also, and the sun literally blinded me. Subaru stopped. And I mean, I came out somewhat aggressive, and that truck stopped on a dime, probably 6 inches from that Subaru. Now, if that vehicle is not calibrated correctly, and it's seeing that vehicle in front of it, maybe at a different distance or not responding when it was designed to, now we've got another $10,000 damage.
You know, that's the kind of stuff, though, that it always concerns me, right? I'm the old guy that I get in my vehicle, I turn all that stuff off. I use my mirrors. I don't need it beeping at me, telling me I'm going to hit. I can see it in the mirrors, so I turn it off. But my kids, when they get in the vehicle, they'll start backing up, and they don't even look. They're just listening for the beep, and they just go. You know, so I think about how much they rely on these systems, and then when they go out there, if somebody's done a calibration and it's not working right, and they're counting on that system, does it lead to a collision because they're counting on the system and it didn't work? You know, I mean, there's a lot on our shoulders when we're doing these repairs to make sure this is done right, because sometimes it's life or death whether you do it right.
I think that's a great point because there's a difference between the occupants that are driving the vehicles from the last 80 years of driving, right? It's like, you know how to answer and dial a rotary phone, so do I. The kids that are just starting to drive today wouldn't know what that is.
Yeah.
They rely on these systems, they rely on technology, and to be without it is, they count on it. This is something that they count on as a part of their life, technology, and it needs to be right. And if it's not, when somebody's counting on something and it goes wrong, it can go wrong very, very badly.
And you realize that not all vehicles need that that environment, that perfect environment with the level floor and the dimmable lighting and no sunlight coming in any windows. But there are still a high percentage that do. So if you're if you're calibrating, or you have a sublet calibration company that's just strictly mobile, then that environment becomes pretty critical. And does that environment actually exist at the shop? And so it may be impossible to actually get a good calibration on that vehicle, at the facility simply because the conditions aren't there. You can't create the conditions. So it really becomes a responsibility of the shop to make sure if they are using an outside source, how are they performing those calibrations? And again, no disrespect to our dealer partners, but those environments don't exist there. And just, it's almost like, leaving lug nuts loose. And the study even mentioned that, like, if you put in the vehicle back on the road, if all you're doing is looking for dash lights, maybe scanning and then test driving to see if sensors are going off, you're putting the vehicle back on the road somewhat blind. You don't know if it's going to see what it's supposed to see at exactly where it's supposed to see it.
Yeah, some of what you said. So I moderated a panel last week at Reuters Automotive USA in Detroit, and we had a whole bunch of OEM representation there. And one of the things that I mentioned in the panel was that the reality is the collision repairer sees all of this technology long before the manufacturer, the dealer, ever does. The customer goes off the lot when they buy the car and they crash it 10 minutes later, it's going to a collision shop to get repaired. So the collision repairers need to get the training, the understanding, the tools, all that stuff to do those repairs. It's, again, critical. It's the training, it's understanding what you need and getting that stuff done right. And I also want to circle back. You talked about sublets and using some sublet vendors to do this. And I have conversations with shops all the time where they're telling me, well, I don't do my own calibrations because I don't have the right conditions and facility to do it. But then they're bringing an aftermarket into their facility to do it. And I said, well, if you don't have the right conditions, how do they have the right conditions, right? So that's still the same challenge. And then I always like to remind people that if you have a sublet vendor that's coming out to the shop and performing calibrations in your parking lot, he's not doing it right. There's not a static calibration that I'm aware of that can be done in a parking lot. You need that level flat surface in most cases. You need the right lighting. You need no reflections. I've literally seen photos of people with like pieces of cardboard draped over the top of the camera on the windshield trying to block the sun so they can do the calibration. Guess what? It's not going to calibrate right. Again, I said it earlier, these systems are incredibly sophisticated, but they're trusting. They're assuming that you've done everything right leading up to the point that you hit that button to calibrate it. If you've done something wrong, but it can still see the target, it's going to calibrate. It's just going to calibrate to the wrong specs. It's going to be looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, but that's pretty scary because you can get these vehicles to calibrate by manipulating targets and the placement of targets so that it sees it. But now it's not seeing it at the right place. And, there was a question that was asked in the MSO symposium on Monday to a major carrier, which I thought the answer was pretty interesting. And it was about what do you require as a carrier to verify that calibration was done correctly? And couldn't answer it. It was, I think the answer came back as the invoice. Well, the invoice doesn't verify and doesn't validate that a vehicle is calibrated correctly. So as an industry, what do we owe the consumer? What do we owe the vehicle owner and the carrier from a documentation standpoint that was actually performed correctly and it calibrated correctly. And that also is a pretty scary deal. You know, if you look into the future again, where we're dealing with, you know, vehicles that, you know, even the baseline vehicle today has all the systems on it. And when we look in the future, where the roads are filled with vehicles that are looking for other vehicles, looking for lines on the road, looking for pedestrians, that type of thing, and the accident rate that's out there, and the failure rate of these calibrations, we got a big concern. We've got a job to do. And the only way that I think that we actually build confidence back into consumers, into the safety of the roads, is through a high level of transparency around that vehicle. Not only the calibration, but how the vehicle was actually repaired, right down to the calibration with verification that it did calibrate correctly to factory specs. Even some of the manufacturers have to improve some of the equipment that they're giving us. You know, there's still manufacturers out there that saying, you know, use a tape measure, and the study mentioned that, and a plumb bob. Well, when you're talking about degrees that make a difference on a, you know, with regards to a safe and proper repair, that just doesn't work.
I think one of the other comments that came out in, I think it was at CIC, we had, and I want to give him credit for it, it was Dane from Honda up on stage talking about the ADAS calibrations, and somebody asked him, when are they required? And he said, 100% of the time. You know, if it's been in a collision, 100% of the time. When does it need to be done? He said it twice, 100% of the time. If we could get all vehicle makers to come out with a very hard, fast, defined, this is when it's required, make it very clear, make it easy to understand, I think it would be very helpful for everyone, and it will help the consumer understand what needs to be done for their vehicles. You know, we all know that studies show consumers assume quality. They assume you're going to do it right, but they don't necessarily know what needs to be done. There needs to be some education for them as well to understand.
Yeah, I think that goes on several different folds as far as that goes. I think the information is there. The training, the knowledge isn't. The 800-pound gorilla in the room is, okay, I'm a shop, how do I get compensated for this calibration? It doesn't specifically say 100%, but I know that it does. It says that it does, but now I've got friction across the board. So where do I go? Or do I fold and just say, well, they wouldn't pay for it and that's it? These are things that plague our industry day to day, and we have to we have to overcome that with training and knowledge of that third-party bill payer, that they also understand that the liability of saying no when they've been presented with correct information has to have some sort of teeth in it.
You're so right, Andy. It is about education, because when you think about it, that carrier, that insurer is going to likely insure that vehicle when it comes out of the shop. So they have a vested interest in a safe and proper repair as well. If that vehicle's on the road, it's not calibrated correctly, and it's a potentially dangerous vehicle, you know, again, it's a liability for the carrier as well. So we have to really start thinking about that and working together as an industry for a solution. You know, you hear all the time, you know, scratch on the bumper comes off, we repair the scratch, and we finish the bumper. It shouldn't need to be calibrated. Everything went back together the same way, right? There wasn't a lot of damage there. There wasn't an impact. And you think about it, it's almost, somebody used the analogy, I think it was a friend from 3M, where if you have a rifle with a scope on it and you take that scope off and you put it back on, are you assured, do you have confidence that that rifle is zeroed in? No, absolutely not. You go back and you zero it in again. Same analogy, right? With all of this technology, just because you remove it and there's no, you know, significant impact, just because you remove it requires you then to calibrate again.
Well, that's the example I gave earlier, right? I watched somebody take a bumper cover off to paint a fender, put the bumper cover back on, and we had a calibration problem. So that's all it takes, you know. I don't know how we get everybody to hear it. We've been saying it over and over and over for years. It's, you know, it's the education piece. getting everybody to understand and do the right thing.
So on the education piece, I think we've all had different shops. Everybody come up to us and say, "Well, I want to start doing calibrations. You know, what do I do? What equipment do I buy?" When that question is posed to you, what's your first response?
It's typically go back, analyze your business, understand the type of vehicles that are going to be coming into your shop so that you understand what their requirements are. Because to just go out there and try to be, buy all the equipment for all the vehicles, all the manufacturers, it's very expensive. So I typically tell them, go back, look at your business, understand the book of business, what's coming in, what type of vehicles you're seeing, and then make your decisions on equipment and what type of facilities are going to be required. If you're, for example, if you're going to fix a lot of Fords, well, almost all of their calibrations are dynamic. So now you're driving the vehicle to calibrate it. So you may not have to make an investment in the facility, but if you're doing a lot of Hondas or Nissans, or now you've got to have the facilities and have it right. So it just depends on what you're repairing.
Yeah, and I think it's important for everyone to understand the difference, that dynamic calibration. You're right, they say self-calibrating, and then people perceive that, well, you don't have to do anything with it. Well, no, you have to drive it so it learns its systems back. And then the challenge there becomes in inclement weather or in states where there's a lot of snow, then are you having the car having to sit until weather passes to calibrate it correctly? Static calibration is all done inside of a controlled environment. So to some degree, that's easier because you have a controlled environment. So any day of the week, you're able to calibrate that vehicle. And it just comes down to really the question, are calibrations, recalibrating the vehicle, is that optional? Well, no, it's not. The study proves that it's essential. I encourage everyone to go out and there's these summaries of the study out there. There's also a podcast on it, and it's pretty profound. And after you get done really understanding all the work that was done in that study and how detailed they got into it, there's no question left in your mind that these calibrations are absolutely critical and must be done with validation that they were done correctly.
Yeah, for sure. We have, like I said, we have an entire ADAS technician role that we have, but the hands-on training, probably the biggest or the most consistent comment that we get from people, because we have a 3-day hands-on course where you're in a shop calibrating for 3 days. The most common response we get is, I had no idea what was involved in doing these calibrations until they got there to do it.
There's no easy button.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.